Gene Hackman's autopsy report just came out, and what it says is truly chilling. What should have been a simple case took a turn that no one saw coming. There was no forced entry, and there was no clear cause of death. Instead, there are a lot of strange and unsettling details that make it clear that this wasn't just old age. When forensic experts looked more closely, they found something much more disturbing than anyone was expecting. Mr. Gene Hackman's death at age 95 was caused by hypertension, atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, and Alzheimer's disease, which was a major factor. Was G. Hackman's death more than it seemed, and could the truth have been hidden? Stay with us, because this story is only getting darker. Without further ado, let's watch the video from Thursday, February 2, 7, A Mysterious Discovery. Investigators say she died of natural causes, and based on the circumstances, it seems likely that Miss Hackman did die. Before we tell you the shocking new details that the most recent autopsy revealed, we need to start at the beginning of this story. It began with silence. It's not the peaceful kind that comes with a quiet afternoon or evening, but the kind that lasted too long and made people uneasy. At first, no one thought much of it. Gene Hackman, who was 95 years old, had been living a private life for years with his wife Betsy Arakawa. They didn't like having guests over or trying to get attention, but there was Life Grocery runs sometimes make phone calls and moves in and out of their Santa Fe home. This time, though, they hadn't been seen or heard from in weeks. Calls went straight to voicemail, and text messages were left unread. A neighbor noticed that their mail was piling up, which had never happened before, and there was an old edition of the newspaper still sitting at their doorstep. It was like time had stopped inside that house. At first, friends tried to convince themselves it was nothing. Hackman might have been sick and was recovering in bed, or Betsy might have taken him to the hospital, or they might have just left town without telling anyone. They were very private, but as the days went by, people started to worry and someone had to check in. That's when the first unsettling detail showed up. A maintenance worker went to the house expecting to hear Hackman's familiar voice calling out, or at the very least, Betsy telling them everything was fine. But as they got closer, something felt wrong. The front door was slightly ajar, indicating that someone had either left quickly or never finished leaving. This was enough for the police to be called. When they arrived, they cautiously approached the situation. An elderly couple had been missing for weeks. There were a dozen possible explanations, such as a medical emergency or an accident. But as soon as they walked inside, something felt off. The air was heavy and still, like when time has stopped inside a house. The police found Gene Hackman lifeless in the foyer. He had been there for a while and didn't have any obvious injuries. No blood, bruises, or anything else. But the way he was lying there felt strange. Then they found Betsy, who wasn't near him but in a different part of the house and was also lifeless. Both women died at the same time and in the same house, but nothing about the scene made sense. There were no broken windows, broken glass, or overturned furniture. 2 people were missing, but there were no signs of a fight or damage. There were also no signs of a break-in. The next problem was that the bodies had been there for days or even weeks. Hackman's pacemaker data later showed that he had probably died 9 days before they were found. But what about Betsy? Had she died at the same time? If so, why hadn't she called for help? That was just the start of the mystery. An autopsy was the only way to find out what happened in that house. Was it a tragic accident, a sudden medical event, or something else? Investigators didn't know it yet, but the case they had just walked into was about to become much more disturbing than anyone had expected. When they walked into Gene Hackman's Santa Fe home, the air was heavy and still, as if nothing had disturbed it in days. It was a house like this that had once been lived in full. Life seemed to have stopped moving, like it was stuck in time. The first thing they noticed was that nothing seemed out of place, at least not in the way they thought it would. There were no signs of a break. The windows and locks were still in good shape, no drawers had been rifled through, and no furniture had been overturned. It wasn't the scene of a robbery, and it didn't look like a clear crime scene. But something was wrong. As the police carefully looked around, they noticed that the front door had been left slightly ajar. This was the first thing that Hackman and Betsy noticed. were known to be private. Would they have left their door open, or had someone else come in? The house was in good shape, but it didn't feel like it had been lived in. There were no new signs of recent activity, no dishes in the sink, no lights on, and no TV humming in the background. The house wasn't destroyed, but it was very quiet. Then there were the details that didn't make sense. In the bathroom, a heater was still on, even though it didn't seem like it was needed. It wasn't cold enough to justify leaving it on if the couple had been in trouble. The pills were found scattered near Betsy's body. Some bottles were open and others were closed. Later, investigators found that the pills included Tylenol, a drug used to treat high blood pressure, and thyroid medicine. It wasn't clear if the pills had been taken as prescribed or if something else had happened. Had she dropped them in a fit of stress? Had they been spilled? Or was it something else entirely? In another one of their 3 dogs, Xena, was found dead inside the house. The other 2, Bear and Nikki, were still alive but weak and malnourished. This made people wonder what had happened to Xena. Had she died of starvation or something else? Why had the other 2 dogs lived while she hadn't? There was also the issue of time. Investigators found that Hackman had probably been dead for at least 9 days before anyone found him. This was based on information taken from his pacemaker, which recorded his last heartbeat. Betsy's heartbeat on February 17th, but it was much harder to tell when she died. Had she died that same day, or had she been alive in the house with his body for days? If so, why hadn't she called for help? To make things even more confusing, there wasn't a clear cause of death. At first glance, there were no signs of external trauma like bruises, cuts, or injuries that could have come from an attack or struggle. Carbon monoxide poisoning was quickly ruled out because no leaks were found in the house. Mobile phones and a 2025 monthly planner were both taken to be looked at more closely in the hopes that they would give clues about the couple's last days. Were there messages, missed calls, or any other signs of what had happened inside the house? Even though there were no obvious signs of foul play, investigators weren't ruling anything out. The scene was too strange. The open door, the pills, the dead dog, and the pacemaker data. Everything pointed to something strange, and the more they looked, the more unsettling the case became. Findings: Gene Hackman and Bet Erikawen's bodies were taken to the New Mexico office of the medical investigator, where forensic pathologists began their investigation. Because of the couple's age, it was thought that natural causes might have caused what happened. But the more they looked at the evidence, the harder it became to come to a clear conclusion. Hackman's pacemaker data gave an exact timestamp for when his heart had stopped beating on February 17, which was the first major piece of evidence. 2025, which was 9 days before his body was found. That meant he had been dead for over a week before anyone noticed. His level of decomposition was consistent with that timeline, which made it even more clear that he had died before Betsy. Betsy's time of death, on the other hand, was much less clear because both bodies were so far gone. Given the timeline, it was possible she had lived for days after Hackman's death, but why hadn't she called anyone? To make things even more difficult, both bodies had gone through a process called partial mummification, which can happen in dry places like New Mexico, where low humidity slows down decomposition. This made it even harder to figure out exactly what killed them. Toxicology tests were immediately ordered to look for any signs of poisoning, overdose, or exposure to harmful substances. Since there was medication lying around near Betsy, investigators wanted to know if she had, although toxicology reports take weeks to finish. Authorities were left in the dark while they waited for more information. In the meantime, the initial report did confirm a few important facts. Neither Hackman nor Betsy had been physically hurt. There were no bruises, fractures, signs of strangulation, or defensive wounds. If there had been a fight or foul play, it wasn't immediately clear from their bodies when it happened. Hackman was 95 years old, but his medical records showed that he didn't have any life-threatening illnesses at the time of his death. He did have heart disease, which was normal for his age, but he wasn't in critical health. He hadn't been hospitalized recently, and there were no known emergencies leading up to his death. Betsy, on the other hand, was 65 years old, much younger, and in good health. She had no history of major illnesses or conditions that would have explained an unexpected. Investigators were confused about how both of them could have died so quickly and without a clear cause. Another strange thing was that they didn't seem to have eaten or drunk anything in their last days. The kitchen didn't have any recent meal preparations, dirty dishes, or other signs that food had been eaten. This could have meant they were sick and not eating, but it also raised the possibility that something had stopped them from eating or drinking, which the authorities ruled out. Carbon monoxide poisoning was one of the first things that investigators thought might have happened because the bathroom heater was on. However, tests showed that there were no traces of toxic gas in the house. At this point, there were no obvious external injuries, no immediate toxicology results, and no clear cause of death. The results left investigators with more questions than answers. So far, the only thing that was clear was that whatever had happened to Gan and Betsy was not normal. But that was just the beginning, because what they would find later. Before we talk about that, let's go back to the investigation. The initial report didn't give investigators many solid clues, so they turned their attention to what was inside the house. If Hackman and Betsy weren't poisoned by carbon monoxide or having what looked like a medical emergency, then what had happened to them? The first thing the police did was look at their daily routines. Hackman hadn't left the house much in recent years, but he was still independent and able to do things on his own, even though he was old. Nearby stores' surveillance footage showed that he was last seen 2 weeks before his death shopping at a local grocery store. He didn't look weak or sick. He just seemed like his usual quiet self. Betsy, on the other hand, was more active. She took care of most of the housework, including finances, errands, and talking to doctors. Investigators looked at her phone records and found that her last known outgoing call was made just days before Hackman's estimated time of death. There were no texts, calls, or other signs that she had asked for help after that. When detectives searched through her personal belongings in the house for clues, they found a 2025 monthly planner on the kitchen counter that was still open to February. Hackman and Betsy had written appointments and reminders in it, but for some reason, the entries stopped all of a sudden. Up until the middle of the month, everything was normal, like regular checkups with the doctor. Investigators also found 2 cell phones. Both of the couple's phones were found in the house and were taken in for forensic analysis. Police wanted to see if either phone had any recent messages, unanswered calls, or other signs of distress. One of the biggest mysteries was why Betsy hadn't called for help if she had been alive for days after Hackman's death. As the forensic team continued to look through the house, they found something else, a fully stocked kitchen that showed no signs of recent use. The refrigerator was full of fresh food and groceries that hadn't been. There were no new dirty dishes in the sink, and Betsy's coffee machine hadn't been turned on in days. Investigators also noticed that it was very unusual for 2 people living in the same house to stop eating or drinking all of a sudden. This made them think that something had completely changed their normal routine. The condition of the house itself raised more questions. There was no sign of forced entry, and all but one of the windows and doors were locked. The front door wasn't broken into, and wallets, purses, and other valuable items were still inside. The house hadn't been ransacked, but something seemed off. The police also looked at emergency call records to see if anyone in the neighborhood had reported suspicious activity near the house, but there were no signs of intruders or strange noises. It was as if whatever had happened inside the house had left no trace other than the bodies. At the same time, the couple's medical records were also being looked at. Hackman's health had been stable for a man in his 90s. He had heart disease but wasn't in any immediate danger. Betsy, who was 65 years old, didn't have any serious health problems, so there was no reason to think she would have died suddenly just days after her husband. But here they were, with no clear explanation, no witnesses, and no apparent cause of death. Investigators had to look deeper to find out what had really happened in that house, and why it seemed like the answers were being buried under more questions. Was there a hidden threat as detectives continued to piece together Gene Hackman and Betsy Arikawaka's last days? They started to think about less obvious threats. something that might not leave clear evidence. If the house hadn't been broken into and there were no signs of violence, was there something else that killed them? One of the first things the police looked into was the possibility of environmental toxic. Even though carbon monoxide had already been ruled out, they still looked for other harmful gases or airborne radon poisoning, mold exposure, and even dangerous chemicals were thought to have had an effect on the couple. Tests done inside the home showed no significant levels of toxic substances, air quality readings were normal, and there were no signs of contamination in their water supply. This ruled out another possible explanation, but also made the mystery deeper. Next, investigators looked at the couple's food supply. If carbon monoxide wasn't a factor, could food poisoning have played a role? The kitchen was still stocked with fresh fruits, vegetables, meats, and dairy. Investigators didn't find any spoiled food left out or anything else that would suggest they had eaten something bad. However, forensic teams took samples of everything in the fridge and pantry to test. One area of focus was botulism, a rare but deadly form of food poisoning that can cause paralysis and respiratory failure. Some foods, if improperly stored or contaminated, could have given them the toxin, but this wasn't the case. It was just a theory because toxicology results would take weeks to confirm if anything was in their bodies. Another thing investigators thought about was how the medications might have affected each other. They knew Betsy had prescription pills close to her body, and both she and Hackman had been taking different medicines for years. Based on medical records, Hackman had been prescribed blood pressure and heart medicines, and Betsy had been taking thyroid medicines and other prescriptions. Some medications, when mixed incorrectly, can cause serious side effects like dizziness, confusion, and even sudden cardiac events. However, there was a big problem with this theory. Hackman and Betsy had been taking these medications for years without any problems. It was unlikely that they had suddenly taken the wrong dosage at the same time, but until the toxicology results came back, the authorities couldn't say for sure. Then a new theory came up. This was a case of starvation or dehydration. The evidence inside the Hackman and Betsy hadn't eaten in days, according to the house. The refrigerator was stocked, but nothing had been prepared. There were no dirty dishes, no food scraps in the trash, and no signs that meals had been made. Authorities wondered if an unknown illness had rendered both of them unable to care for themselves. If one had become seriously ill, the other might not have been able to get help, but medical records didn't show any previous reports of sudden health declines. There was also the matter of communication, as 2 cell phones were found. Inside the house, it seemed odd that neither phone had been used to call 911 or even a friend. Betsy's last call had been before Hackman's estimated time of death, and there had been no calls after that. If she had lived for days longer than him, why hadn't she called for help? Investigators now had a troubling puzzle. There were no clear signs of a crime, a gas leak, or poisoning. They needed toxicology results, forensic analysis of the phones, and any Hackman and Betsy both died in their homes days apart without a clear cause. And even though people tried to find logical answers, something about the case still felt very unsettling. This brings us to the final report and shocking new evidence. The final autopsy report was supposed to bring clarity, but it only made things more mysterious. Gene Hackman had died 9 days before his body was found, that much was clear. But what the forensic pathologist found in his report shocked everyone. Gene Hackman's autopsy report revealed shocking new details. According to people familiar with the investigation, Gene's body showed signs of long-term distress before he died. His nails were damaged, as if he had been clawing at something, and his wrists and arms had small bruises that were unusual for a man who hadn't fallen or been hurt on the outside. His skin also had pressure marks that don't happen from sleeping in one place, but from being pressed against something. Investigators had spent weeks trying to figure out what happened, but none of them had thought about the fact that Gene Hackman was restrained. If Hackman had been held down and unable to move, then this wasn't just a case of an elderly couple dying in tragic circumstances. It was something worse. Toxicology results only added to the confusion. No lethal substances were found in Hackman's system. He hadn't been poisoned or overdosed on any drugs. His last moments showed that he hadn't died peacefully, which brought up an even scarier question. Had he been tortured, and if so, by whom? The house had no signs of forced entry. The front door was ajar, but nothing inside suggested a violent struggle. Nothing had been stolen, but Hackman's body told a different story. It looked like he had been tortured. Betsy's autopsy, while less detailed, didn't give any real answers. There was no clear cause of death, no organ failure trauma. It looked like she had just stopped living. But if Hackman had been hurt before he died, what had happened to her? Had she seen something so traumatic that it killed her? Investigators tried to figure it out, but nothing made sense. The open door, the pills, the dead dog, the heater, the food that hadn't been eaten. It was all jumbled and confusing. If someone had broken into the house and restrained Hackman, why leave without leaving a trace? More importantly, the final report left too many questions. Hackman's official cause of death was listed as undetermined. But that word felt like a placeholder, a way of admitting that something didn't make sense, even if no one could prove it. There were rumors of foul play, but without solid evidence, there was nothing to look into. Just a famous actor and his wife missing in a way that made no sense. Even now, the mystery remains. The case is still open but stalled, and there are no new witnesses or sudden confessions. Just a series of when put together. These stories paint a picture that no one wants to believe. If Gene Hackman was tortured before he died, then someone was in that house, and whoever they were, they left without leaving a trace. If Gene Hackman was restrained and suffered in his last moments, then someone was there. Who were they, and why did they leave without leaving a trace? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more videos. Until next time.